Welcome, everyone. I'm Angeline Terry, a student in the Emerging Media Department. On behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences, I welcome you all to our final Teach-In Tuesday event of the 2021-2022 school year. With Teach-In Tuesday presentations, the College of Arts and Sciences fosters discussion and reflections on social and cultural problems that we face locally and globally. Today's event will begin with a presentation from Sociology professor Dr. Patricia Maddox about the importance of LGBTQIA youth coming into their identities in affirming spaces. After the presentation, STEM Inclusive Excellence Program Manager Dr. Hugh Smeltekop will facilitate a conversation on the topic with Professor Maddox, School of Social Work Director Ande Nesmith, and Adjunct Professor Melissa Hendrickx. To start our conversation, here's Dr. Maddox's pre-recorded presentation on LGBTQIA youth and spaces of affirmation.
Hello, I'm Patricia Maddox. My pronouns are she, her, hers, and I would like to talk to you today about LGBTQIA youth and the importance of spaces that affirm their identities as they embark on their journey through childhood and adolescence. I identify as a white, cisgender, lesbian woman, and while I'm confident in these identities today, it wasn't an easy journey to get here. It was filled with moments of denial, setbacks, anxiety, resilience, affirmation, community building, and an overall acceptance of my identities from those who mattered most in my life. I started my life as the first of soon-to-be 5 children, to a young mother and Vietnam veteran father living in Miami, Florida. My parents often joked that my sister, Michelle, who's in this photo, was brought into this world to entertain me. Being the oldest of 5, you could say that I was never alone. So much of my childhood and adolescence was spent with others. From kindergarten through 12th grade, I was involved with the Girl Scouts, and where I was lucky to be surrounded by a fabulous group of girls. We all grew up together, shared experiences, and answered each other's relationship questions. Like any typical adolescent friendship group, we shared bits and pieces of our lives with one another. I was also actively involved in my high school marching band and concert orchestra, where I played the saxophone and the bassoon respectively. Many of my high school and Girl Scout friends were in the band, and we spent much of our high school years together playing music. I had a boyfriend during high school that was part of the band, and like most typical teenagers, I was trying to figure relationships out. My life sounds stereotypical for a teenager. I was active, social, and well supported by my peers. But everyone around me was straight. I was also harboring a bit of a secret that I was attracted to women and felt pretty unfulfilled in the relationship that I was in. But I was doing what other teenagers around me were doing. I was dipping my toes into a normal heterosexual relationship. In all these spaces, I didn't have one close friend that identified as gay, and my mind kept telling me that my thoughts weren't normal. I didn't know any teachers that I could talk to, and up until this point in my life, I hadn't even read a book with a gay character. I gravitated towards the show My So-Called Life and would watch Ricky deal with homophobia at school for being gay. He was also a guy, and while I could relate with his character, in some ways, and others, his life seemed so different from my own. After high school, I went to Stetson University for undergrad, and I met some of my best friends there. I jokingly tell my first-year students that I was a res hall unicorn. I had the same roommate all 4 years. But everyone I knew at Stetson was heterosexual, and aside from counseling services, there wasn't any spaces for me to learn about gay and lesbian identities, or to meet others who shared these identities. After spending a couple of years at Stetson, I took my first women's studies class and fell in love. I eventually minored in women's studies because I was able to read about people like me. I saw myself finally in the curriculum and started to feel like I had built a community that would be supportive when I came out. But I was still really nervous of being rejected if I didn't. My roommate Beth was the first person I came out to this spring of my last year at Stetson. I still remember her saying in a thick Worcester, Massachusetts accent, "Well, yeah, dude, was just waiting for you to tell me. I love your roomster." After that, it seemed like I could be me. I told the other women on the slide, and they too were very supportive. I told my family, though, the summer after I graduated, and for the most part, no one was really surprised, but it was still a very anxious time in my life. I waited until graduate school to tell my grandparents, And my dad was the very last person I told. I feared being rejected by those that I loved the most. I left home the summer after graduating from Stetson for the next adventure, graduate school in Chicago. I met my soon-to-be wife there. She was in medical school, and we've been together for 20 years now. I shared my coming into my identity journey with you all today because every young person's journey is different. But what they all share is the thought that someone could reject them. Coming out developmental models stress the importance of the diversity of the journey, as the process usually begins in childhood with feelings of being different, to coming out through various stages of one's life, and ending when a person no longer views themselves primarily in terms of sexual orientation. With different but similar models for trans-identified individuals, some of these models, such as Beeman and Rankin's, explain as starting with a child feeling gendered different, seeking to present as a gender different from the one assigned at birth, to repressing or hiding their identity in the face of hostility, to possibly misgendering their identity, to learning and meeting other trans-identified people, to possibly changing their outward appearance to look more like their self-image, to establishing new relationships with families and friends, and developing a sense of wholeness while also living in a gender-normative society. We also know through research that, like my story, young people learn when, where, and with whom they can share their identities safely. I also shared my journey because it highlighted some of the ways we can support and affirm queer youth identities, especially given the climate around banning and censoring LGBTQIA bodies and their voices. We know through research that the process of coming into our identities is a vulnerable time for young people, and any discriminatory experiences during this journey can also hinder the development of a healthy LGBTQIA identity. Currently, more than 150 anti-LGBTQ bills have been introduced this legislative session. Most of these bills are targeting young people. Bills like Tennessee's ban on LGBTQ lifestyle issues, also known as HB 0800, which would bar any discussion, textbook, or instructional materials on LGBT issues or lifestyle in public schools. Or Oklahoma's book ban, also known as SB 1142, prohibiting certain public school libraries from keeping books about the study of sex, sexual preferences, sexual activity, sexual perversion, sex-based classifications, sexual identity, or gender identity, or books that are of a sexual nature that a reasonable parent or legal guardian would want to know of or approve of prior to their child being exposed to it. Under this proposed legislation, if a parent guardian requests the removal of a book for these reasons, and it's not removed, the parent gets paid $10,000 for each day it stays on the shelves. And even when bills weren't introduced, folks with power still found ways to impact LGBTQ people. For example, Governor Greg Abbott issued an executive order in February to the Texas Department of Family and Protective Services to launch full child abuse investigation into parents of trans children because they provided their children with gender-affirming medical care. Many of the bills that were introduced this legislative session centered around preventing trans youth from participating in sports that match their gender identity. For example, in March, Governor Hutchinson signed SB 354. The law prohibits transgender girls and women from participating in girls' and women's sports. Arkansas also passed a ban on gender-affirming health care for transgender youth. On February 3, 2022, Governor Noem signed into law SB 46, which bans transgender girls and college-aged women in South Dakota from playing in school sport leagues that match their gender identity. Here in Minnesota, 2 bills were introduced, HF 1657, which reads, male student participation in female athletics restricted, male access to female changing facilities restricted, and criminal penalties provided. Another bill, HF 352, which reads, female student sports team participation restricted to the female sex. These bills restrict trans youth from spaces that affirm their identity, and they can be dangerous and have adverse effects on the lives of trans youth. Concerns regarding unfair competitive advantages are also unfounded in research and often grounded in sex stereotypes about the differences and abilities of male versus female bodies. Schools are important spaces for youth. After all, we spend most of our early lives in these spaces. We hope that young people are in spaces that affirm and support the development of their identities, as we know that young people can feel invisible and silenced if they do not see their experiences or identities represented in coursework, classroom dialogues, and with conversations with teachers and guidance counselors. That's what makes some of these bills and now laws particularly problematic for young people. Florida's controversial Parental Rights in Education bill, also known as the Don't Say Gay bill, which is now a law, bans public school teachers from providing any classroom instruction or that of third parties on sexual orientation or gender identity from kindergarten through grade 3, or in a manner that is not age appropriate or developmentally appropriate for students in accordance with state standards. The law also requires parents to be first to be notified of any health or support services offered to their kids in school and allows them the chance to deny these services on behalf of their children. In states like Florida, youth may be losing resources like teachers and supportive staff and curriculum that would provide environments of inclusivity and spaces of affirmation. But the logic behind this law is that families would be the affirming spaces for the nurturance of children and youth identity development. What we know, though, is that many LGBTQIA youth do not feel affirmed at home, even though research also tells us that when families accept LGBTQIA youth's identities, suicide rates decline. Because of the lack of family acceptance for some LGBTQIA youth, school is a place that they felt most affirmed. While the law's focus in Florida is on K through 3, which trans children are developmentally beginning to understand gender in a very gender binary society, access to children's books and important LGBTQIA historical figures are important normalizing agents during this developmental time in a child's life. Ohio recently introduced HB 616. The bill states that curriculum or instructional materials on sexual orientation or gender identity would be banned in classrooms starting from kindergarten through 3rd grade. In grades 4 through 12, such instruction would be banned if presented in any manner that is not age appropriate or developmentally appropriate for students in accordance with state standards. It is unclear, though, how age appropriateness or developmentally appropriateness is defined and applied in either the Florida law or the Ohio bill. Bills and laws are not the only ways we've been targeting classroom materials. Banning books with LGBTQIA themes, characters, and storylines has also been implemented. This slide shows you a few of the books that have been banned in schools this year. Many of the books on this list are banned because one of the characters are members of the LGBTQIA community. Aside from the books Drama and Melissa, which are intended for middle school readers, the rest are for high school audiences. The book All Boys Aren't Blue by George Johnson recently found itself in the news. In 2020, a Florida school board member in Flagler County filed a criminal complaint citing that it violated obscenity laws because it had a Black, queer, non-binary character. In the book, All Boys Aren't Blue, Johnson details their experiences growing up in New Jersey and Virginia as a Black, queer, and non-binary person. The book became a bestseller when it was released and was named one of the best titles of 2020 by Amazon book editors. Students in Flagler County came together to protest the removal of the book from the school library. According to the Center for Disease Control, creating and sustaining inclusive school environments, policies, and programs and practices that include LGBTQ youth is one strategy for improving the health and academic success of all youth. Inclusive in this context refers to the presence of clear policies or practices that address the needs of LGBTQ students who might otherwise be excluded or marginalized due to factors such as sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. The CDC, with the help of the National Opinion Research Center, created a self-assessment tool to help school and district staff understand their own schools and what current policies, programs, and practices they employ that may contribute to safe, inclusive environments where all youth can be successful. On this slide, you see two questions that educators can individually use to assess their inclusivity around LGBTQIA youth. By providing spaces of inclusion and affirmation, young people can be free to be themselves. But how safe are our schools for LGBTQIA youth? In 1999, GLSEN, the Gay Lesbian Student Education Network, identified that little was known about the school experiences of lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer youth, and that LGBTQ youth were nearly absent from national studies of adolescence. They state that they responded to this national need for data by launching the first national school climate survey and continue to meet this need for current data by conducting the study every 2 years. The 2019 School Climate Survey found that for LGBTQ youth, school can also be an unsafe place. GLSEN found in 2019 that school bathrooms, locker rooms, and physical education or gym classes were most commonly avoided, with approximately 4 in 10 students avoiding each of these spaces because they felt unsafe or uncomfortable. 1/4 of LGBTQ students avoided school athletic fields or facilities or the school cafeteria because they felt unsafe or uncomfortable. In 2019, GLSEN found that almost all LGBTQ students, 98.8%, heard gay used in a negative way. Examples like, "That's so gay." 75.6% heard these remarks frequently or often, and 91.8% responded that they felt distressed because of the language. 87.4% of LGBTQ students heard negative remarks specifically about transgender people, like the word tranny or he, she used. 43.7% heard them frequently or often. And 68.7% of LGBTQ students experienced verbal harassment, called names or threatened at school based on sexual orientation, 56.9% based on gender expression, and 53.7% based on gender alone. According to GLSEN, including LGBTQ-related issues in the curriculum in a positive manner may make LGBTQ students feel like valued members of the school community. It may also promote more positive feelings about LGBTQ issues and persons among their peers, thereby resulting in a more positive school climate. In 2019, attending in a school that included positive representations of LGBTQ topics in the curriculum was related to less frequent use of anti-LGBTQ language. Specifically, LGBTQ students in schools with an LGBTQ inclusive curriculum heard homophobic remarks less frequently than students in schools without an inclusive curriculum, and heard negative remarks about gender expression less frequently than students in schools without an inclusive curriculum. In order to address school climate concerns, gay-straight alliances, or as they're called today, gender and sexuality alliances, were created. In 2019, most LGBTQ students, 61.6%, said that their school had a GSA or similar student club. These school clubs focus on providing LGBTQ students a safe and affirming space within a school environment that they may otherwise experience as unwelcoming. The Gay Lesbian Student Education Network states that beginning with our 2001 National School Climate Survey, GLSEN's research has tracked the availability of GSAs and has demonstrated a significant rise in the number of the clubs from just 31.1% of LGBTQ students in 2001 having them to 61.6% in 2019. Further, GLSEN's research has examined the utility of these clubs and has consistently found that the presence of GSAs at schools can have a positive impact on the experiences of LGBTQ students and can help alleviate the negative effects of a hostile school climate. GSAs are providing youth with the ability to socialize and get to know others in positive spaces, and providing them with the ability to learn about LGBTQIA topics. Youth are also given the opportunity to make positive changes in their educational environments. LGBTQIA youth are resilient. So often they're presented as weak and in need of saving. But just like all youth, they need to feel affirmed in spaces, especially those that matter the most to them: schools, families, doctors' offices, sports teams, and their peer groups. These are spaces that most teens spend the majority of their time in. And when they can't find these spaces in person, new social media outlets like TikTok and YouTube allow young, queer, non-binary, and trans youth virtual spaces to see others like them. As I conclude today, I leave with you a few recent books in sociology that highlight the lives of LGBTQIA youth and young people, and how we can better support and affirm queer, trans, and non-binary youth. I also leave you with a few questions today. What's the harm in allowing young LGBTQIA youth folks spaces of affirmation? What's the harm in all students learning about the contribution members of the LGBTQIA community have made? What's the harm in allowing youth spaces to grow into their identities? I want to thank you too for allowing me to share my personal journey with you.
Thank you, Dr. Maddox. Dr. Hugh Smeltekop will now lead a discussion with Dr. Maddox, Professor Ande Nesmith, and Professor Melissa Hendrickx.
As Angeline said, I'm Hugh Smeltekop, Program Manager for the STEM Inclusive Excellence Program here at the University of St. Thomas. As we begin the conversation, please send questions you would like our panelists to comment on using the Q&A function. We will wrap up the discussion a little before 1 p.m. To give time for our audience to formulate and contribute questions, let's hear initial responses from our panelists. Professor Hendrickx, let's start with you.
Thank you. My name is Melissa Hendrickx. I use she, her pronouns. And I think our identity journeys are impacted by so many things. I think for me personally, the generation that I grew up in was marked by less overt discrimination against the queer community, but a lot of silence. And so being gay, bisexual, trans, it just wasn't a vocabulary that was used. And so I grew up feeling out of place, but I could never pinpoint why, because I didn't have the language and I didn't have role models to model for me what it meant to be in same-sex relationships. One particularly impactful moment came when I was a sophomore in college. I was on the track and field team, and one of my teammates came out to the entire team. And I remember just the overwhelmingly positive response that she received. And even though I was still formulating my own identity at the time, I needed an example like that. I needed to see that support and that community that individual felt. And it was very liberating to see that. Like Dr. Maddox, I came out at the end of my college years, and no one was surprised. I often joke with people that I was the last to know that I was gay. But as I continued to come out to a wider group of people, my worry increased because I started with the people that I knew were safe. And as a member of the queer community, I think we are always assessing our safety. Every space we go into, we have to ask ourselves, how free am I to be myself and to talk about my family or about my identity? My first teaching job came immediately after I graduated. I was teaching in Texas, and neither my school nor my school district listed gender identity or sexual orientation in their anti-discrimination policies. And so I felt very much like I needed to be back in the closet. And not only did that impact my teaching, but it also impacted the way that I could support students. I knew that I had some students that were questioning their own identities, that were experimenting with gender, and I felt very hesitant to offer support because I was afraid of being outed, and I was afraid of the ramifications that might cause. And so there really is a trickle-down effect when, on the policy level, we don't have those supports listed. This spring, I've had the absolute pleasure to teach an LGBT literature course here on campus. It has been the most fun that I've had teaching in the 7 years that I've been here at St. Thomas. And one thing that I've heard from so many of my students is that they wanted to take this class because they wanted to read about people like them. And they wanted to see stories of characters and authors who had similar experiences to them. And so just having that visibility, I think, is so crucial. And so as we think about a lot of the legislation that has come through recently, we're essentially just creating more spaces of invisibility. And we're limiting students and even parents or caregivers' ability to see their families reflected. It has hit me personally in the last couple of years. I have a 2.5-year-old and a 4-month-old. And I think about the message that they would be sent if they knew that their teacher couldn't read a book about their family. And the impact that that has, not just for them, but for friends and for other caregivers and supporters. And so I think we have to really think about the messages that we're sending of, are you welcome here? And what does it actually mean to show that somebody is welcomed?
Thank you. Professor Nesmith.
Hi, thank you. Well, I was really moved by both of your stories, honestly, and there were definitely pieces of it that were familiar to me and probably any queer identifying person at that time in history or even more recently. I will say that one of the things that was shocking to me when I wanted to have a child, I was in another state and learned that if something happened to me in childbirth, my partner, who I'd been with for 7 years at that point, likely would not get custody of that child because in the eyes of the law, she was equivalent to a stranger. And we moved here specifically so that we could adopt her, but even then we had to, I had to give up my parental rights and then we had to adopt together. And that seemed, for a child that we had wanted so bad, that seemed really backward. And it speaks to me about how much, while we have to do all these changes, one-on-one interactions and in the classroom, we also really have to go further upstream. I'm the director of the school social work, and at social work, one of the things that we do is we focus a lot on social justice, and we talk about the person in their environment, that if we want to change something for an individual, we cannot only talk to that individual. We have to see what's going on in their family, what's going on in their community, what's going on in society. And we have to address and tackle those things too. So a big piece of what we do is really making sure that the right people have a seat at the table, the decision-making table when policies are made, because a lot of times that piece of the discussion and how policies are informed, not the people who are the most affected are not always there or don't always have a voice. And when we're talking about youth in particular, people who maybe even aren't of age yet to vote, they have a lot of people speaking for them. In social work, we talk a lot about the dignity and worth of the person. That's our starting place, and that's for all people no matter what their situation is. Even if they're in prison for murder, it doesn't matter. Who that person is, that they have an inherent right to dignity and they have inherent worth. So one of my areas that I have studied over the years as a social work professor is foster care and youth in foster care. And one of the things that was really striking to me is how many of them, first of all, started out on the streets, and they ended up on the streets because they had families who didn't accept them for who they were, either because of their gender identity or their sexual orientation, or sometimes even just how they presented, whether or not it was even aligned with how other people saw them. And then those kids ending up in foster homes, finding a place where they were going to be accepted was really, really challenging. They weren't, there weren't enough foster homes in general to take care of adolescents in care, and there's even fewer that are comfortable taking in a kid who identifies as non-binary, transgender, gay, lesbian, queer. For a while, there was an organization that was really trying to make some efforts to identify specifically gay and lesbian adults who would be open to taking in children and youth who identified as LGBTQ. And we've also seen a growing interest, and there's been an organization here, a host home organization here in Minnesota that also had its roots in adults from the queer community saying, well, you know what, these are our children. Even if they're not biologically related to us, we have some sort of obligation. We have something we can give back to them. Let's take in some of these young people who are struggling. And so informally gathering people who identified as GLBTQ, taking in young people who identified as GLBTQ who had been living on the streets and forming, their own families, essentially. So I guess I just want to, I'll just wrap it up by saying that I really think that we have to pay attention to equal opportunities, basic rights, and people having a seat at the decision-making table when we're talking about policies.
Thank you very much. Those were two really impassioned and really beautifully responsive reactions to your talk, Dr. Maddox. Do you have anything that you'd like to respond to based on what they've just talked about?
I think what Dr. Nesmith said was brilliant in that there's a lot of people speaking for youth today. And one of the things that we're seeing as resistance from some of these bills and bans are young people mobilizing, coming out, speaking, taking it to the streets, fighting against some of their school boards to say, enough is enough, and are you going to listen to us, is what they're asking for right now. So young people, especially in Florida and in Texas, taking to TikTok and sharing their experiences with some of these laws and bans and how that's going to impact them as an individual. And using social media as a way to kind of tell their stories, because we aren't really listening to young people, and we really should be listening to them. So that was very impactful, yes.
Yeah, thank you. We do have a question. Do you think that the number of people coming out as LGBTQIA plus youth and adults is increasing because of affirmation spaces, or do you think it's due to other reasons? I'll just open that to whoever would like to respond.
Almost seems like a sociology question, but I'll give it a try. I think it's complicated. I think it's a lot of things. There certainly was some political will to start being more inclusive. We started seeing things shifting in the media that we consumed. Not all media had to be filtered through companies that told us what we could and couldn't watch. And there had been a lot of the classic gay character sidekick who was often the funniest one on the show, and slowly moving into making those characters more central. Also, the fact that they got in that position was a little bit of force of society, and the fact that made more and more people consuming that as part of the information they received, I think also played a role. And we'll see. I mean, we go back and forth, right? But I think that youth speaking out, absolutely, they have found their voice more and more over time on lots of topics, and I think this one as well.
I think if we go back to what Professor Hendrickx said too, I mean, that silence part of my generation at least, I'm in my 40s, and you really didn't see any role models, you didn't see many characters on television talking about their queer lives. And so I think some of the ways of getting out of that silence has been, this notion that there are more queer people on TV, there are more queer people in books. And what scares me with some of these bills and laws right now is that we might go back 2 decades into that silence area, where it's not that there aren't queer people, it's not that there aren't LGBTQIA folks, it's that they're afraid to say that they're LGBTQIA, right? And to me, that sets us back way into, all of the problems we see in the literature around discrimination and, repressed homophobia and, all of the negative behaviors that we've dug ourselves out of for so long, right? And so I hope that we don't get back into that silent era, and that's kind of my goal with this talk, but yeah.
Anything to add?
No, I just think it's important to always remind ourselves that people within the queer community, they have existed as long as there have been people. And just because we choose to talk or not talk about it really doesn't impact their sense of identity. It just might impact their ability to share it and their ability to feel safe with it. But having a conversation or not having a conversation is not going to make or not make somebody trans or gay or whatever it is.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Hendrickx. The next question is, what do we know and hear from our LGBTQIA students' experiences on our campus and at their homes?
That's a great question. I think what we're hearing is, We need more classes where they can see themselves in the curriculum, read books with LGBTQIA historical figures and literary works, and have spaces where they can feel free to, have someone affirm their pronouns and have someone affirm their sexual identity, right? Spaces where they can talk about their lives in their papers or in their coursework, right? I think those are some of the things that some of our students are saying. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would add just from my own class, because that's the focus of what we're talking about. And I would say maybe about a half of my 20 students identify somewhere on the LGBTQ spectrum. And one thing that I found interesting, I heard this from a couple different students, is we would read a text from a character or an author who perhaps didn't have a lot of acceptance at home, and their reaction to that was almost that they felt glad to have read that because they felt like they weren't the only ones. And I found that interesting in the sense that for a lot of these students in this generation, they've come to believe that acceptance is more normalized. And so when they don't feel that acceptance, they feel even more isolated because they seem to think like, well, everybody else has a supportive family but me. And so having that kind of spectrum of experiences in what we've been reading, I think has been really affirming for them.
Absolutely.
Professor Maddox, you talked about the different models we have that describe the coming out process and kind of coming into recognition and then into a sense of self. There's a question here that says, it's fortunate when one reaches sexual identity synthesis. However, the questioning can be a very hard stage for people to sit in, explore, and find resources about. How can this population be supported?
Yeah, just again, having spaces where they can go and converse with others who might have an LGBTQIA identity, affirming teachers, support staff right at their schools. Even just a book sometimes helps me see myself in somebody else's shoes. I mean, one of the banned books on that list is Alison Bechdel's Fun Home. I mean, to me, Fun Home was very much relevant to my life, where, it just seemed like things were always a little bit of dysfunction at home. And so it made me feel comfortable in my own coming into my identity journey that, I was hesitant on telling certain people in my life about my sexual identity, right? And so seeing yourself reflected in some of those books is really important. But, I think just places where you can go and know that you can sit and just be, I think are really important. And how do we highlight to young people, I guess, would be some of the questions that I would, ask everyone here, How do we let people know that our space is a space where people can just be, right?
I would add that I think that young people need the message that they have time. Nobody has to hurry up and figure out what an identity is this minute. And you know what? It can be fluid. So the whole synthesis thing, sometimes that works. And for some people, it doesn't. How they identify themselves can morph over time. And sometimes I feel like we're in this huge rush I need to label for you, and I need to know who you are and how you identify. And so I've had some students say, I don't want to have to put my gender terms on Zoom because I'm not ready. I don't know the answer. And so part of my message too is that that's okay, and that we do change over time, and that if you reach a point in your life where you're like, you know what, I'm just not, I don't want to be in a box or labeled in a particular way, that's okay also, is a big piece of it. And one of the things that I have found, when I first decided I was going to start saying aloud in class at the beginning, naming who I was and having a picture of my family up, and then I didn't do anything more than that when I was first doing this, the number of papers that came back with references to someone having an LGBTQIA identity just skyrocketed, even if it didn't really fit with the topic of the paper. It was so clear to me that they were trying to reach out in a way that felt safe. So I think just even having that place where who can I identify with or who can I feel like I can talk to matters as well.
I think sociologically, the cool thing about looking at identity is that it's not really fixed. Like, our identities fluctuate as we go throughout the life course. And so young people are on this journey to figure out who they are. And, you know, it takes a lot of time. I mean, I'm still trying to figure out who I am. I don't know about some of you. But it is quite that adventure. But I did note in my talk, too, that adventure can have a lot of holes in it if you do face discrimination in certain aspects, right? Where you no longer feel like this is a possibility, a road that you can choose to journey along on, right? And so, you know, you have to be very careful around the discriminatory piece for LGBTQIA youth.
The only thing that I would add is it's super important to, you know, create these spaces that students can go to or young people can go to, but we also really need to come to them and do so in a way where, you know, maybe it's just a mention in class, you know, or it's embedding little bits of diversity into curriculum, because I think I feel lucky in the English department that I can share stories, and so I feel like there's a lot of bridges that are easy to make, but you know, giving those little mentions here and there so that they maybe don't have to put in a lot of the effort to go seek it out makes a difference as well.
There is a question here about how you would respond to someone who considers queer identities wrong or abnormal or unnatural. How would each of you respond to that kind of either sense of self or just a general sense as you move through the world?
I'll tackle that one. I would say that, so I teach radical empathy, and part of that is before I can start to make any kind of push to change somebody else's opinion, I have to fully identify where they're coming from. I don't have to agree with it, but I have to fully identify with it. And one of the things that I have my students practice in class is sitting down with somebody who has a very, very, very different opinion on whatever, fill in the blank with you, and listening and listening and asking questions without ever having in mind that you're going to change their opinion until you can restate their position back to them so perfectly they think that it was better than their own argument. Then they know you have connected with them, you at least know where they're coming from, and then I think you can get some inroads, because a lot of times those attitudes come from one's own anxieties, own worries, own insecurities. That's why the word homophobia has phobia in it. But you can't get there in terms of changing people until you understand. And the other thing I would say is something that's much less time consuming also is these very little, these small responses where you kind of say, wait, what did you just say? Where are you coming from? That's got a little hint of a challenge without a full-on confrontation. Can also just in the moment in a short conversation get somebody to maybe notice they said something off. I'd be interested in hear what others have to say about that.
Yeah, I would say two pieces. One is, so I work for a nonprofit called AmazeWorks outside of teaching, and we work with a lot of schools on anti-bias curriculum. And when we have teachers who say, you know, it just is against my beliefs to read a book about two moms or two dads in class, we work with that teacher and we work with the administrators to say, like, okay, we need to find somebody who can, because it's part of the curriculum, but we always go back to what are the values of your school? And if the value of your school is that students feel safe, families feel seen and heard, then that needs to be part of the conversation. And so it's really about kind of, you know, standing up for and following what those values are. And that might mean making some accommodations. The other thing I think it speaks to is the importance of allyship, because when I get that question or I get that challenge about something about me innately is wrong, I react to that very personally. And it is, you know, radical empathy for me in that situation is more difficult. But somebody who perhaps is cisgendered, heterosexual, I think that's a great place for them to step in and to practice being an ally for others, much like I can be a white ally in conversations around race. Like a challenge about somebody who is a person of color affects me differently. You know, that I can probably step into a space and not have some of that personal reaction. And so I think building that community of support is really key in those situations.
There's an interesting question here about LGBTQIA youth. It says, do you think that LGBTQIA youth of this generation specifically have something to teach older generations about affirming spaces and acceptance? And how do we make those youth voices heard?
It is a different message. My daughter, when I was growing up, it was L and G, and then we added B, thinking we were being inclusive, and then T came later, and Q came after. I mean, we were not the most inclusive community. I'll just say that right now. We were not, and we didn't know that we weren't, and we're probably still not, even when we start adding more letters to the alphabet. So my daughter has taught me a lot about that, and a lot about terminology. We weren't paying attention to gender pronouns or things like that when I was coming of age. So I think we have to listen to our younger people. The other thing is they're getting all kinds of messages from social media about themselves all day long. That is a different thing it's a totally different beast to battle than going in just into the classroom as a kid like I did, where I just had the humans that were in front of me versus all of society. I think we have a lot to learn.
I think allowing young people a seat at the table is important, right? I mean, again, we're making decisions on behalf of them without listening to them and hearing what it is that they want, right? Do we talk to young people about their school systems and find out what it is that they like about going to school and what they don't like about going to school, right? Do we have them a part of curriculum and policy changes at schools? So I think allowing them a seat at the table is definitely a start to change, because like everyone is saying here, young people know what's going on. They know way more of the terminology, and they also face a lot of the hostility and the discrimination today too.
Yeah, absolutely. I think giving them a chance to speak. I mean, even at a young age. I mean, a kindergartner can tell you, like, this is what I want to feel like when I'm at school. So I think giving them space,
We have a question that comes back to St. Thomas specifically. As faculty and staff, what are some concrete things that we can do to support our LGBTQIA students at St. Thomas based on your conversations with students and your experiences?
Speaking up, speaking out. I would say you were talking about the mentions, as many as possible in your classrooms. Defining excuse me, diversity in a way that includes them. Learning, because even if you grew up lesbian, as I did, that doesn't mean that I know everybody else's experience. And, you know, pushing back on policy too. There's been a lot of changes in policies at St. Thomas since I've been here, and they didn't happen just by chance. They happened because people spoke up. And I would add, I just want to put in a plug for the lavender graduation. You know, there are things like that where we're really truly acknowledging and celebrating. It's not all about trying to stave off all the negative, but the space for celebrating and experiencing the joy and the positive, I think, is important as well.
Absolutely. Flying a pride flag would be probably nice here at St. Thomas. But hopefully, too, more community is built, right? So sharing spaces and hearing voices of queer faculty, staff, and students here at St. Thomas would be an amazing start. You know, taking the Tommy Pride, becoming a Tommy Pride facilitator would be a great way to let your classrooms be spaces where, you know, LGBTQIA folks can feel welcome. Those are just some starts.
Yeah, and I think the recognition that we cannot separate what happens outside of the classroom from inside the classroom, right? And so when there are issues in the news, when things come up on campus, if we are silent about them, you know, we can't expect our students to learn effectively when they have those outside things on their mind.
Well, this has just been a very rich and wonderful conversation. I feel enriched, and I live in a space where these are discussed a lot, and I hope that it was also enriching for all of our guests today online. So that's all the time we have for questions today. Thank you to Professor Maddox, to Professor Nesmith, and Professor Hendrickx for joining us to discuss this topic.
We hope you found this Teach-In Tuesday informative. Watch for details on the 2022-2023 Teach-In Tuesday presentations returning in the fall. On behalf of the College of Arts and Sciences, thank you for joining us.